Good morning, church. What a blessing it is to be able to worship a King who didn't want heaven without us, but brought heaven down. Amen. Don's traveling this morning, so I'm going to be sharing a word with you. My name is Zane McGee. If you don't know me, then you probably know my wife, April McGee. She's much more popular than I am, so I've just taken to introducing myself as April McGee's husband. If you don't know April or myself, then you probably have at least seen our three boys, all under the age of 10, all various shades of redhead. And if you haven't seen them, then I'm certain that you've heard them in the church building. So there's one other fact I want to share with you all as an introduction to myself. And I hate to begin introducing myself with a boast, but whenever the Lord has been generous to you and kind, it's only right that in front of his people you acknowledge that. So I wanted to begin with the boast of letting you all know that I am also a Dallas Cowboys fan. And there are some, I see that we are joined by some of God's people today as well. So you might ask how I became a Dallas Cowboys fan. And if you knew that I grew up in Texas, you would assume that growing up in Texas makes me a default Dallas Cowboys fan. But that's not necessarily true. The first time that I remember becoming, for myself, making the decision that I was a Dallas Cowboys fan was in the early 90s during the rivalry that existed between the 49ers and the Cowboys. And if you remember this time, it was a heated rivalry that existed because these two teams always found themselves head-to-head in competition for titles. And then not only that, but the games that they played always tended to be filled with dramatic moments. And so there developed a harsh rivalry between the Dallas Cowboys and the 49ers. And so you might wonder why a 10-year-old at that point would think that this is the moment that I have to decide I'm committing my life to the Dallas Cowboys. But you might wonder what hatred I had for San Francisco that motivated such a decision. But the truth was, I don't have any emotions about San Francisco. I don't have any emotions actually about the 49ers. But the 49ers happen to be the favorite team of my older brother. And so that was grounds enough for me to make the decision that from this point forward, I am a Dallas Cowboys fan. Because that's the role of a younger brother, right? Is to antagonize the older brother as much as possible. And so from that time, the decision I made as a 10-year-old in a relationship and in my relationship with my brother and determined by our relationship, that decision I made as a 10-year-old still stays with me to this day. I am still a Dallas Cowboys fan because of the decision I made because of my relationship with my brother. And just for the record, so it's noted, he is now today a Dallas Cowboys fan. So we see who won out on that. But this question of how we make decisions in our life and how the relationships that we have with other people determines the decisions that we make in our life is a question that we're going to be exploring today. And we're going to be exploring it because that same question is a problem for the church in Corinth. That the church in Corinth is having difficulty with living in relationship with people who are different than them. And so as we get into the text today, we're going to see that this manifests itself in this particular case, that what appears to be the problem is that it's a problem of spiritual giftedness. That some in the church are claiming that they have the gift of speaking in tongues and that is the superior gift, and others are claiming the gift of prophecy. And so we see in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 2 and 3 says this. This is Paul's response to the controversy going on there. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. And so Paul sets up or addresses in these two verses the struggle that's going on in Corinth between these two types of giftedness. And what this passage tells us, and what really all of the letter of 1 Corinthians tells us, is that the struggle how to live in community with people who are different than yourselves has been a struggle for the church since the very beginning. Since the opening days of the church, this question of how I will live with others who are different and how we will find unity despite our differences is the question that presents itself and challenges the church as it goes through. And so that's the question that we're going to explore today. And when we talk about differences, I think it's easy for us to think that we have to imagine extremes. That we have to think about, I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, so I'm against the 49ers, right? We have to picture ourselves and picture whatever the exact opposite is to think about differences. But the truth is that as human beings, anybody who is not us is different and automatically presents difficulties in relationship. Sometimes it's the people who are actually most like us that we have a hardest time having relationship with. You would think that there's probably no one closer in this world to me as far as who I am than my brother, right? But what's one of the key things that marks relationships between siblings? What's the phrase that we use? It's a sibling rivalry. Because sometimes even those who are like us present challenges for relationship. I have an example of this in my own life of how I've struggled and wrestled with this question. My wife and I were missionaries in Brazil for 6 years. We were married on December 8th, and then we began training as full-time missionaries on January 7th. So let me say those dates again. Married December 8th, missionaries January 7th. I'm not a marriage counselor, but I'm going to give this as a free pro tip. Major can use it in his counseling sessions. Don't go into full-time mission work with only a couple weeks worth of marriage, right? Get a little footing under yourself. Not only were we newly married, but I was also a young 20-something. I was very confident in myself. I felt very good about where I was. I had just graduated with a Bible degree from a Christian college. I had done several years of ministry as a minister with a church. I was feeling very confident in myself as a prepared missionary. I was feeling, with several weeks' worth of marriage under my belt, I was feeling pretty confident about myself as a husband as well. Turns out that I would find out later that was not the case. And it takes several years of marriage counseling to make up for the first few weeks of marriage. But we went to the mission field with me being confident, ready to serve, and knowing that I was going to go and just change the world. 6 years on the mission field, we come back. And if you talk to missionaries, one of the things that all of them will share with you is that one of the main difficulties of serving on the mission field that you don't expect is it's not always leaving that's hard, it's sometimes coming home that's hard. Because the country that you remember leaving may or may not be the same, but it's not the same as how you remember it when you left. And then you as a missionary too have changed over that time. And so it became a question for my wife and I of how do we reintegrate ourselves into society? How do we, after living as outsiders for so long, after living as those who don't speak the language, who don't know the culture, who don't wear the right clothes, how do we come back and live in a society where we are the insiders or where we're perceived as the insiders? But it also raised the question for us of our boys. Two of our boys were born in Brazil, and that's all they had ever known. And so it became a question for us as parents, how will we raise our boys so that they are aware that now that they are insiders, they have to be aware of those who are outsiders, that they have to be aware of those who are outliers. And so it became a constant question for us, both my wife and I as individuals and with our children, of how do we teach our boys and how do we ourselves interact with those who are different. And so the world provided several suggestions for us about how you do this. The first of these suggestions was that you respond with hostility. And you see this in culture all around, that whenever there's somebody who disagrees with you, whenever there's somebody whose opinions do not match your own, then you respond with hostility. You respond with aggression. And essentially this comes out in two ways. One is either we have to separate ourselves so completely from them that we don't contaminate ourselves with their opinions, and so we separate and we keep them at a distance. Or two, we become so aggressive at them that we have to make them agree with us. We have to convert them to our opinion so that we know that we are right and they know that we are right. And if we want an example of this, we don't have to look any further than the great chicken sandwich war of 2019. Right? Who would have thought that a chicken sandwich would inspire so much hatred? And so the debate is whether Popeye's new chicken sandwich competes or exceeds Chick-fil-A's, or whether you're a purist and an original and you continue to support Chick-fil-A from the beginning, right? And if you look on social media, there's opinions abounding on this and which is right, which is wrong. But it's gotten to the point that even the two restaurants are feuding on social media, right? A little bit more serious example of it is, what are the two things that we're always told that you never discuss at family holidays? Religion and politics. We don't discuss religion and politics. And why don't we discuss these two things? Because those two conversations in our culture are relationship-breaking conversations. That if I have a strong opinion on religion, if I have a strong opinion on politics, and I find out that my uncle or my cousin doesn't, or they have a different view than I do, what does it do? It severs my relationship with them. And so we're taught in polite society that we don't have those conversations. We avoid them for the sake of maintaining the relationship. We don't discuss the differences. So that's one approach that we see in culture, is that hostility is the way that we deal with difference. The other that's often promoted is the idea of tolerance. That if we would learn to be tolerant of one another, if we would learn to be tolerant of the differences that we have with other people, then that would solve the problem. A tolerant society would be able to live with differences and still have harmony. And on the surface, this sounds like a really great solution, especially if it's opposed to hostility. But the problem with tolerance, with the idea of our relationship with other people, is it's actually, the problem is in the word itself. To have tolerance means to tolerate something. There's a lot of things that I tolerate in my life. I tolerate Atlanta traffic. I don't love it, but I tolerate it. I tolerate that the supermarket has 24 checkout lanes and only one person working, right? I tolerate people with smartwatches who check them during conversations and think I don't notice, right? I tolerate all of these things. I don't value them. I don't want them. I don't bring them into my life, but they're in my life and I have to deal with them, so I tolerate them. So tolerance means, in a sense, that I am okay with people having their opinions as long as they leave my opinions alone. Right? I'm okay with you thinking what you think as long as I continue to think what I think, and we both stay in our lanes and we don't interfere with each other. Now, against these two options, against hostility and against tolerance, I think there's a third way. And that third way is that we learn to value people who are different than us, to value people in the body of Christ who hold different opinions than us. And the problem with valuing others, or the difficulty with valuing others, is it means that I have to recognize that I myself am not the whole package. That I myself am not the superior form of Christianity or of humanity. It means that 20-year-old Zane, who went confidently to the mission field, confident in himself and confident in who he was and what he was doing, had to come to realize when he walked into a restaurant and couldn't even order food for himself because he didn't have the vocabulary, that he very quickly realized his own shortcomings and was very quickly brought down in humility to realize his place. And so valuing others means that we have to learn to reevaluate our own importance. It means that we have to reassess how important we think we are, and we have to humble ourselves to value the giftedness of others and what they contribute not only to us, to society, but what they contribute to the church as well. So this is the problem that we come to in 1 Corinthians. The church in Corinth, if we want to be as gentle and as kind to them as we can, we would say the church in Corinth is a mess, right? If we read through 1 Corinthians, it's amazing the things that this church is wrestling with. That they're divided about the Lord's Supper and how to practice it, and who can practice it, and when they practice it. There are members in the church suing one another over financial situations. And what's most surprising and shocking to us often is that there's even a member who is sleeping with his stepmother, and people in the church appear to be bragging about it. So it's amazing to read the letter of 1 Corinthians and just think, how has Paul at this point not just thrown his hands up and walked away? How has he not said, I have churches in Galatia, I have churches in Ephesus, I'm going to go where I'm needed, I'm going to go where they're listening, and we're going to work among these churches. But Paul doesn't. He stays with them. He works with them through the mess, and he promotes the idea that the unity of Christ can overcome the differences that they have. And so what we see of the differences in Corinth is it's essentially an issue of favorites. The church in Corinth is full of opinionated people. Luckily, we don't have that problem today, right? The church has no opinionated people in it. But the church in Corinth did. And they had favorites. And some of those favorites that we see as we work through the letter are that from the very opening chapter of the letter, the Corinthians have favorite teachers. And so some of them say, Paul founded this church, and so we will follow Paul in his instructions. Some of them say, Apollos came here after Paul left us, and Apollos turns out to be a pretty good preacher. So let's follow what Apollos says. Some of them say, well, Peter actually walked with Jesus. Peter actually followed and had conversations with Jesus, so we should probably follow him. And then some of them very smugly sit in the corner with their arms crossed, and they say, well, I don't know about these guys, but I just follow Jesus. And so Paul says that the problem is not having favorites. The problem is not that you have a favorite teacher. God doesn't forbid us from having favorite teachers. God doesn't forbid us from having favorite sports teams. After all, we do know that God has a favorite football team, right?
Patriots.
I'm gonna let that one slide. So, the problem that he has is that whenever our favorites and our preferences interfere with our relationships, then they undermine the gospel. That when the things that I prefer and the things that I demand mean that I can no longer have a relationship with you because you are different, then it's undermined the gospel message, and it's undermined the work of Christ. So these favorites continue. We see in chapters 8 through 10 that the issue comes up of food. And whether they can eat food that has been sacrificed to idols, because most of the meat that would be purchased in the butcher shops may have been sacrificed to idols beforehand. And so the question comes up, can Christians eat this meat with a good conscience? Some of them say yes, some of them say no. And the differences between those two camps are dividing the church. We go only a chapter later to 1 Corinthians 11, and we see that the practice of the Lord's Supper is dividing the church. That it appears that the wealthy members of the congregation, those who would provide the actual houses where the church met, those who would even provide food that the church would eat, are inviting their friends over. Those who live nearby can come and eat when the food is ready. They can come and eat when the food is hot. And those who are poorer, those who work longer hours out in the fields or in other districts of the city, they can't arrive at the same time. And by the time they make it to the table, they are literally left eating table scraps. Some in the church are stuffing themselves, others are going hungry. And Paul says your preferences for how you eat and when you eat are destroying the body of Christ. And so we make it to 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, which is where we've been for the past several weeks. And the issue, as we said in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, is the issue of spiritual gifts. And there appear to be particularly two spiritual gifts that don't get brought up specifically until chapter 14, when Paul has gradually been building his way up to this point. So Paul works his way up to this point to say everything that I have told you in chapter 12 about being a united body with different members, everything I have told you in chapter 13 about love, comes to be applied to this issue. Whether those with the gift of speaking in tongues are superior to those with the gift of prophecy. And so it appears that some in the church in Corinth thought very highly of themselves, and they thought the gift of speaking in tongues shows that I am the height of spirituality, that I am the spiritual person. They even took to calling themselves this nickname, the spiritual ones. Paul mocks them in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 1. He says, it's funny that you all call yourselves the spiritual ones because when I was with you, I just seem to remember children in Christ. I seem to remember teaching infants in Christ when I was there. And so they've elevated themselves in their status. And they've presented this gift of speaking in tongues as the height of spirituality. And so just to ask you real quick, if there's a group that's promoting speaking in tongues as the height of spirituality, what gift do you think that group would claim for themselves? I would assume that they're probably claiming the gift of speaking in tongues, right? And so essentially what they're saying is that to show you are a spiritual person doesn't mean you have to follow these biblical principles or these abstract ideas of what it means to be spiritual. To be a spiritual person means that you have to become like me. For you to convince me of your spirituality, you must look and act as I do. And so Paul steps in again here, and he says, you've again missed the point. That when your religion demands that other people have to look like you in order to have relationship with you, it means that you have missed the fact that Christ became like us to have relationship with us. Amen. Christ, dwelling in heaven, supreme and divine, came down to earth to embody humanity in order that we might have a relationship with him. And so we sang this song right before the service, What a Beautiful Name It Is. I referenced it at the beginning, but it has the words about Christ that it says, you didn't want heaven without us, and so you brought heaven down. And Christ didn't only bring heaven down to us, Christ brought himself down to us. That he gave up what he had to come and live and dwell among us. And so Paul says, if you understand the gospel, if you understand what Christ has done for you, then you cannot, in good conscience, demand that other people become like you. You become like them to have relationship. And so we pick up in 1 Corinthians 14. We looked at verses 1 and 2. I want us to look at verses 3 and 4. This is what Paul says. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their, that's verse 3. Speaks to them for strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Verse 4. Anyone who speaks in tongues builds up themselves. But the one who prophesies builds up the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets. And why is the interpretation necessary? So that the church might be built up. Notice the phrase that's underlined here that Paul uses 3 times. The phrase of building up. This phrase we often translate it, if you have your Bibles with you, some translations may actually say the word edifies here. And we often translate this as the word edifies. What is an edifice? An edifice is a building, right? And so to edify literally means to construct a building. It's the imagery of brick by brick building upon one another, to create a foundation that's firm and secure. And so Paul says that if you're going to have a spiritual gift, what you should desire in that spiritual gift is that that spiritual gift serves others and builds up the congregation. And in chapter 14, verse 1, several verses before this, he reminds them that they are to follow the way of love. And so he connects these 2 ideas here, the idea of following the way of love and the idea of building up the congregation. And if we only stayed right here in chapters 12 through 14, we would miss the fact that this idea is actually a core idea throughout the letter, and it's a core idea that Paul introduces into another topic that we've already discussed. At the beginning of chapter 8, we talked about food being sacrificed to idols. And so there were some in the congregation in Corinth who were saying that Paul has come to us. Paul has told us that there is only one God, that if there is only one God, that means that there are no other gods. And if there are no other gods, then food sacrificed to idols is nothing, right? And so why can't we eat it? If there's no God behind these idols, then let us eat. What we know allows us to eat this meat. And so to that group, Paul says this. He says, be careful and make sure you're aware that knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Amen. And so think about the contrast between these two. That when I think about puffing up, I think about somebody just sucking in a big breath, right? Somebody puffing out their chest, making themselves bigger than they are. But what have you done? You haven't done anything to yourself, to your actual body. All you've done is filled yourself with air. It's false, right? The other thing I think about is the air packs that now are used in packaging. When we were younger, right, you got bubble wrap. You had hundreds of little bubbles you could pop, or you could cheat like I did and just twist them all at once and pop them all. Yes. But air packs now come in what it essentially looks like a Ziploc bag that's full of air. And these, my boys love them because you can take them and you can put them behind your mom when she doesn't know it, and you can jump on them, and you get a pretty good scream out of your mom, right? But what's left of that bag after it's been burst? There's nothing. Substance-wise, there's nothing left to that deflated bag. And so that's the idea that Paul has here, is that one thing that you do puffs up. It just fills up with nothingness. And the other builds up. The idea of brick by brick. I think of children's Legos. And if anyone has ever made their way across a Lego-infested floor, you know that Legos are nothing to be trifled with, right? That a Lego stacked Lego upon Lego hurts. When you step on it, it does not break. It does not bend. It does not give way. And so Paul says, knowledge puffs up with nothingness, but love builds up. And the other thing that's missed in this verse is that Paul's speaking of 2 different groups of people. That when he says knowledge builds up, the question is, knowledge builds up who? Knowledge builds up ourselves. But love builds up. And who does love build up? Love builds up others. And so the New Living Translation translates this verse in this way, I think, accurately. They say, while knowledge makes us feel important, it is love that builds up the church. So Paul connects these 2 ideas in 1 Corinthians 14. He brings them both up. In verse 1, he says, follow the way of love. In verse 4 and 5, he says that when you are following the way of love, you will choose spiritual gifts that build up the church. Here's what I want us to pick up on at chapter 14, verse 1. That when Paul references love, he's referring back to the immediate chapter. He's referring back to chapter 13. And chapter 13, as we've discussed, is the famous love chapter, right? And why do we keep coming back to chapter 13 in a series that's about chapters 12 through 14? We keep coming back to it because 12, 13, and 14 are one long argument by Paul. And at the core of that argument is the love chapter. At the core of this question of how you deal with spiritual gifts, Paul brings the congregation to the concept of love. And he says, this is how you will solve the problems that you're facing. And so 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 begins with love is patient, love is kind. This is the concept, that the part of the passage I think we're probably all most familiar with, right? What I want us to note is that Paul didn't write this for a wedding. Paul didn't write this for a Hallmark card. Paul didn't write this as an abstract philosophical description of what love is. He didn't even write it as a theological description of what love is. That when Paul talks about love, Paul means Christ. And that to know Christ is to know love. And that if you want to know what love is, you have to look at Christ, and you have to look at the example that Christ has left us and the sacrifice he has made in order to have relationship with us. And that is what love is. And so we wouldn't be off base, I think, in this verse for us to replace the word love with Christ. And for us to read, Christ is patient. Christ is kind. He does not envy. He does not boast. And we're comfortable with that. I'm comfortable talking about Christ being patient, Christ being kind. And what putting Christ in here instead of love does for us is it helps us realize that when Paul talks about love, he's not concerned about theological descriptions. He's concerned about action. He's concerned about what love looks like when it's enacted. And he's concerned with about what it means to embody the concept of love. And so again, we return to verse 14, chapter 14, verse 1. Paul tells the Corinthians, the current solution to your problem is to follow the way of love. And what this is it's an appeal to the previous chapter that we've just read, that if the Corinthians are to solve their problems, if we are to solve our problems of how we live in harmony and in unity with a church body that has different people in it, then we have to embody the way of love. We have to embody the way of Christ. And so what that means is that 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 that we just looked at isn't replaced only with the word Christ, that it's actually replaced with the word I. And that what Paul expects us to be able to do is to say, I am patient, I am kind, I do not envy, and I do not boast. Now, I don't know about you, but being a father of 3 young children, I can't make it past the first 3 lines of that verse without feeling like, that's not me, right? To read this, the further and further you get into it, the more uncomfortable it gets. Because we don't feel these things. We don't feel them in our lives to be true. And so no matter where you find yourself today, whether you find yourself with 20-year-old Zane, who is very self-confident and very assured of where he is and what he's doing, or whether you find yourself with 30-year-old Zane, who can't make it past the first 3 words of this verse, Paul puts before our eyes the example of Christ as the goal to which we are moving. It's not what we currently are. It's not what we constantly can be or are. It's not the way that we always live our life perfectly. But what he holds in front of us is this view that we strive after being like Christ to become these things. And we hope and we imagine the day that we will be these things. So no matter where you find yourself in that, I want us to end today by reading this passage together. And it's our tradition here that the elders are stationed around the auditorium. If you would like to share any prayers, if you would like to share any concerns, they would be happy to hear and talk with you on those. But as we read through this, I want you to think that no matter where you find yourself today, this is the goal that we press towards. This is the image and this is the way that this church will find unity amongst difference, is by embodying 1 Corinthians 13. So together, let's read slowly these verses. I am patient. I am kind. I do not envy. I do not boast. I am not proud. I do not dishonor others. I am not self-seeking. I am not easily angered. I keep no record of wrongs. I do not delight in evil, but I rejoice with truth. Let's pause right here for a moment. Slowly think through this. I will always protect, always trust, always hope, always persevere. I never fail to love.
Let's stand together. Let's stand together, family.